It'll start
All right,
momentarily.
we are currently recording. So, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again for another edition of the Educational Freedom Institute's In Conversation podcast. Again, this is Corey DeAngelis, the Executive Director at the Educational Freedom Institute. I'm also the Director of School Choice at the Reason Foundation. I'm joined, as usual, by my co-host, Matthew Nielsen, who is the founder and board chair at the Educational Freedom Institute. This week, we're joined by a very special guest. We're super excited that Dr. Walter Williams, who is the John M. Olin Distinguished Professor of Economics at George Mason University, has joined us to talk a little bit about school choice and his thoughts on the movement and what's going on with the school choice debates today. Dr. Walter Williams is the author of scores of articles in scholarly journals, popular publications, and he has appeared on many TV and radio programs over the course of decades. So thank you again, Dr. Walter Williams, for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. So, Dr. Williams, what we wanted to go over with you a couple of things. Usually we start out with each of our guests with a similar question, which is, what got you interested in education in the first place, or in school choice in general, and maybe just a little bit of background on yourself, if you wouldn't mind, with starting with those couple of questions.
Well, I've been teaching for quite a while at George Mason University. I've been there I start my 40th year in September. And I've taught at California State College and Los Angeles City College and Temple University for 8 years. And so I've been in teaching, and I've been around education for quite a while. And it seems like much of the evidence shows that if one seeks upward mobility, he had better. It's good for him to have considered raising his education or skills level. And and so I think I'm very, very concerned about upward mobility, and particularly for poor people. And upward, education offers them a way out of the problems that they face. I know I grew up very, very poor in North Philadelphia, and the only way that I got to where I am today was through the educational process, and then luck and chance and help by many others. That is, people don't go from the Rich Allen Housing Project in North Philadelphia to where I've gone without help from many people who may be, and some of whom might be unknown.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that all sounds great to me, Dr. Williams. But I saw your article at Foundation for Economic Education, which you kind of knocked down all of the myths against school choice. So I'd really like to get kind of your responses on a couple of those myths and what people say against school choice and your responses to them. So, for example, some people say that school choice could be problematic because that will just destroy the public school system. What is your initial response to that?
Well, that's kind of confession. That's saying that if people have a choice to do something else, they won't. The public school system will be in danger. I think that it's just like you say, if people had a choice of supermarkets, certain supermarkets just would not survive. I think that that choice puts the power in the hand of the consumer, and the consumer is in the case of primary to secondary education, the consumer is the parent and their child.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's funny, Dr. Williams. That's one that Corey uses a lot. So you have a friend there with, as far as supermarkets go, the analogy. He likes to throw in Walmart, Trader Joe's, and who else? Who's the other one?
Harris Teeter, Safeway. But yeah, the idea is that in those systems, consumers can choose. They are not forced or residentially assigned to go to one particular place. And I mean, with food stamps, we give the money to the parents instead of the grocery store directly. So it's glad we're on the same page there. So another kind of myth that's that's related in this discussion that a lot of people don't like to say out loud that much, but it's kind of inherent in the argument against school choice. Is some people will say that education's complicated. It's not as difficult to choose groceries, for example, as it is to choose a good school. And perhaps low-income families, they argue, may not make the best choices. What is your response to when people bring these kind of information asymmetry arguments up?
Well, that's just that's kind of insulting in the intelligence of low-income parents. Just because they have low income does not mean that they're not. That doesn't mean that they're stupid and do not try to serve the best interests of their children. And matter of fact, if you look at the whole idea of choice, and you go into some poor neighborhoods or slums around our country, you'll see something rather striking. You'll see that there's some nice clothing, there's some nice cars, maybe even some nice houses, and some nice booze, but no nice schools. And so you say, well, how come at least there are not some nice schools? Well, you just have to ask the question: how are clothes, cars, and booze distributed versus education? Well, cars, booze, and clothing are distributed through the market mechanism, and whereby people, if they're not satisfied, they can summarily fire the producer just by not taking their business to them anymore. But however, it's a different question with education. Education is produced in the political mechanism, and in the political mechanism, if you don't have a lot of clout, financial and numerical clout, you will not do very, very well. And if you look at the major problems that many Black Americans face, is the school systems or education is provided by the political mechanism, and you cannot find a more disgraceful outcome in many cities of the educational system. Just as one example, I've written about this a couple times. In the city of Baltimore, matter of fact, the city of Baltimore is the third highest spending jurisdiction in the country in terms of education. But in the high schools in Baltimore, there's in 13 high schools, not a single student tested proficient in mathematics, and only 3 or 4% tested proficient in English. In the other nine other schools, only 1%, and for the whole city, 15% tested proficient in reading. And you find similar outcomes in other cities. And so you say, I've often said that if I were the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan and I wanted to sabotage Black academic excellence, I could not find a better means for doing so than a public school system in most cities.
I'm glad you pointed that out. I mean, another related misconception, I believe, in the school choice debate is people will say that, school choice could lead to racial segregation. But I think a lot of the studies find the opposite, actually, that it actually leads to integration by allowing people to have more choices. Is that your take on the concept of how school choice intersects with, either racial or income-based segregation or integration?
Well, yeah, I think you're absolutely right on it. But on the other hand, I don't think that that Black academic excellence requires that Black people go out and capture a white kid to sit beside. I think that that education can occur just by people having an appetite for education. And my colleague Tom Sowell, he has written a whole lot about education, and he points out that I think in 1890 or the turn of the century in 1900, Paul Laurence Dunbar School in Washington, D.C., which is an all-Black school, did not receive. It was an era of segregation. Did not receive much money, but the Paul Laurence Dunbar students could get higher scores on test scores than every other school in the whole Washington SMSA. And if you look at Tom Sowell's newest book, charter schools and their enemies, it shows that many of the schools in New York, he does a study on schools in New York, primary and secondary schools in New York, and he finds out that at some of the schools that are predominantly black and Hispanic, I think a Success Academy, where its students outscore students in the whole entire state of New York in terms of math and in terms of English.
Yeah, it's a super great book. Matthew and I both have a hard copy of that book already. And it's interesting how Thomas Sowell kind of controls for differences in students by, comparing charter schools to traditional public schools within the same school building to kind of, to control for geography and background of the students. And he still finds that the charter schools are just knocking it out of the park in New York City and elsewhere relative to the traditional public schools. And, his argument is, again, that it's competition, that they have to attract their clientele to in order to make a profit. And
also the point is that the very important point that he makes in looking at some of the schools that are doing very, very well is that there are the school population is predominantly minority, namely blacks and Hispanics and relatively few whites, but they're knocking the ball out of the park so far as on state exams.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I wanted to get your thoughts on why is there so much? The title of Sowell's book is Charter Schools and Their Enemies. Why is there so much opposition? Why are there so many enemies of school choice? Or is it just a couple of groups? And, why don't we have more school choice than we have today? What are your thoughts on?
Well, I think that if you look at the most powerful union in our country is the National Education Association, the teachers union, and school choice, whether it be parochial schools, private schools, or charter schools, it's a threat to their monopoly. And they, as Tom points out, that they're in New York City alone, there are 50,000 students on a waiting list, and this expenditure per student is $20,000 a year. And if all these students are on the waiting list, if they were admitted to charter schools, you'll be talking about $1 billion loss to the public education establishment. And the educationists, they don't want that to happen. And then there's in terms of education in our country, there's a somewhat embarrassing problem at least for the people in education. Is how much education do the teachers have? That is, people who are teaching our students. And it turns out that if you look at some of their performance on teacher certification tests, it turns out to be quite embarrassing. That is, they ask, for example, there's a California Basic Education Skills Test, and most frequently missed math question on that test. These are people who are college graduates. They're taking a test for a teacher certification. Is the most frequently missed math question is 4 times the number plus 4 equals 32. What is that number? And even a high school student who's taken some algebra in 8th grade, he ought to be able to come up with the word 7. And there's on these in places like Kentucky and Tennessee, there's gross cheating by teachers. That is, teachers paying $2,000 to someone to take the test for them, and put down their name on the test. And so there's a lot of dishonesty in the education in our country, and the charter schools and the private schools and the and Catholic schools. They show up some of this gross incompetency and dishonesty.
Mm-hmm.
I have a related news story that just came out maybe a couple days ago, the first time I saw it. But there's a coalition of at least 10 teachers unions who've signed on with the Democratic Socialists of America. And they have a list of demands for what they want in order to reopen schools. They, of course, call for a lot more federal investment in the K-12 public school system. But they also call for things like police-free schools. They want to ban charter schools or ban new charter schools, ban new voucher programs, and ban standardized testing. What are your thoughts on these lists of demands from the teachers unions and the DSA as requirements to reopen the schools this fall?
I think it reveals their agenda. That is, many things that they're demanding has absolutely nothing to do with education. Mm-hmm. But there's something else that they're demanding. The idea of police-free schools. Mm-hmm. That's something that is amazing. I am 84 years old, and when the only time I saw a policeman in our school, in high school, which was one of the lowest, Benjamin Franklin High School in Philadelphia, which was one of the lowest ranking schools at the time. But the only time I saw a policeman in school was during an assembly, and we had to listen to some boring lecture from Officer Friendly talking about safety or some other topic. Now, in the city of Philadelphia, there are 400 school policemen. In many cases that they are armed, and because of so many assaults between students and teachers. In the city of Baltimore, I believe it's 2015 or 2016. I haven't kept up with the more recent data, but an average of on each school day, an average of 4 teachers were assaulted and needed some kind of medical treatment. And so the whole idea that we even need policemen in our schools is something that would be alien to somebody who died in 1950 or 1960. And it says something about what we're doing or what the behavior that we're accepting from students. And if you have so much violence in school, you can't expect for education to occur.
That's interesting. I wonder if we dig into that just for a second, Dr. Williams. What do you think about the possibility of school choice addressing that particular issue? What are your thoughts on school choice as an antidote to violence in schools?
Well, I think that school choice will say, well, look, they just will not accept, or they'll kick out students who misbehave. And so some people will say, who might argue, well, what are we going to do with those students who misbehave? Well, that's not the question. The question is, it's like if you're a policeman and there are drunk drivers and sober drivers on the road. Well, your first order of business is to get the drunk ones off. Now, suppose someone says, well, what are we going to do with the drunk drivers? Well, that's irrelevant. That is, our first order of business is to get them off. And then if there's some way we can help them, do so. The same thing with education. I've read some studies, some years ago, in a 20 student or 22 student classroom. Many times the teacher is spending 80% of her time on discipline. And the study showed that if you could just remove 5 students from the class, the amount of time spent on discipline would go down to an average national average of 17%. And so, so the point is that these kids who are misbehaving, they're making education impossible for everybody else. And so people say, well, what are we going to do with them? Well, you deny them the possibility. You find some way you deny them the possibility of making education impossible for all the other students who want to be education, whose parents are concerned with their education.
Yeah, that's a good point. And a lot of these studies, when they're looking at the effects of discipline, they only look at the effects on the children who are disciplined. They don't look at all of these other systemic results of, if you don't discipline the child, what happens to the rest of the classroom and their learning and the environment for the teachers even as well. So I think that often gets left out of the conversation. I think another way school choice could help, maybe just from matching, students and with educators and schools that they're actually interested in. And maybe, if they're interested, they won't misbehave as well as much. And, private schools have more leniency over the discipline policies that they can have in their schools. So I think that's super interesting to point out.
Yeah, and I think that that one of the things that we as a nation, what we've done, we've replaced ideas and practices that worked with ideas and practices that sound good. Now, I remember as a kid, again, I'm 84 years old. I remember in elementary school holding my hands out for the teacher's ruler because I had done something wrong, and the teacher smacks you on the hand with the ruler. Or in the vice principal's office, he had a paddle in there and the kids were you just were frightened or scared to death by the teachers. Just threatened to send you to the vice principal's office. Well, and I'm nonetheless worse for wear as a result of being spanked or had other kinds of corporal punishment. But we've abandoned corporal punishment today, and I remember thinking as a kid, the worst time to get a spanking from your parent was in the summertime, when the windows are wide open and your friends outside hear you copping plea and begging and saying you'll be good. And then once you go outside, they start teasing you. Now, I've gotten a spanking a whole lot. And today, somebody would call Child Protective Services on my mother. And so, again, we've sacrificed, we've gone from doing things that worked to doing things that sound good, and we've listened to experts and other people who've given us a bum steer so far as what we should do with kids, and I'm saying that one of the things we need to do is maybe consider bringing back corporal punishment.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So I think you're right. Max Eden has done a lot of work on this recently in the Manhattan Institute over the past couple of years, right, Corey, on discipline in schools in particular.
Yeah, he focuses on lax discipline policies and the unintended consequences of these discipline policies that sound good on paper, but could lead to a lot of these unintended consequences of, the teachers not feeling safe and other students not feeling safe. So it's, we can link to Max Eden's work in the show notes as well. But I want to get Dr. Williams' thoughts on, right now, starting back, a few months ago in March, all the schools essentially closed down because of, social distancing measures and trying to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. And I think this might, a lot of people are talking about this as kind of a reimagination of the education system. So, Dr. Williams, do you think that, the lockdown and people, getting a taste of homeschooling during this time could change the education system, or do you think it might just revert back to the long-term trend that we had seen before? Or do you think there's something to the thought of maybe people testing out homeschooling could lead to a change?
Well, I don't know. It seems like if I were guessing, it's going to go back to the status quo because the teachers' union is so powerful, and I think that one of the rather dangerous things that we've done is the whole lockdown. We're looking at we're ignoring some of the secondary effects of the lockdown, such as kids not getting an education, and then according to studies and reports that I've heard of, that it's not likely that younger people will be injured by the COVID-19 virus. Mm-hmm. And there's a considerable argument of to open up schools and of course have some precautions, but again to just open up schools on a very very large scale. And then there are other downward effects of negative effects of our response to COVID-19. A lot of people are dying who otherwise would not die because of the restrictions placed on elective surgery and other kinds of measures that people would take in their health that have been interrupted by by our responses to COVID-19.
Yeah, I think people have, it's talked about how there have been increases in suicides, at least anecdotally speaking. People have been reporting that because, when you're locked inside your house each day, that kind of has a dampening effect on your well-being and mental health. So I think that's another unintended consequence that people really aren't thinking about when it comes to COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the very, very important things about education is just trying to get some of the ideas that Tom Sowell talks about in his book Charter Schools and Their Enemies. He's done a very, very meticulous job of outlining many of the difficulties, educational difficulties that people face, particularly poor people. And what is so remarkable and so disgusting is that wealthier people and politicians, they would never have their kids in the schools that many black kids attend. They would they would not even begin to live in the neighborhood. But however, these politicians, they come out in favor of the National Education Association's stance against school choice or tuition tax credits, but for their own children, they do something differently. And I don't blame them for doing something differently, but I blame for being two-faced. That is, deny poor people some of the educational flexibility that they themselves enjoy.
Yeah, at the Educational Freedom Institute, we started something called the School Choice Hypocrisy Map. So we have people like Elizabeth Warren on the map, who sent her own children to private school, but then opposed it for others. Then we also have Joe Biden, who attended private schools himself, sent his children to private schools. And then I don't know if you saw his recent Unity Task Force with Bernie Sanders, but it's calling to ban for-profit charter schools, ban the DC voucher program. What are your thoughts on Biden's stance, calling to, limit charter schools and then also ban the DC voucher program?
Well, I think it's just more of the hypocrisy of the left. That is, they want choice for themselves, but not choice for others. And the only real choice that they want has to do with abortion.
Yep. Well, hey, we're coming right up on 30 minutes here, Dr. Williams. We really appreciate your time. It's been great talking with you, and it's been a real pleasure. So thanks so much for taking some of your time out today to talk with Corey and I.
And I thank you for inviting me.
Great. All right. Thank you, everyone, again for listening to this week's edition of the Educational Freedom Institute podcast. Again, that was our special guest, Dr. Walter Williams. We will link to his bio in the show notes. And thank you so much for listening, everyone.